Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back for another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, much to my surprise, this sub's favorite band member is still doing YouTube videos about this sub from Slayer991, and they added, oh, look, I checked to see if Jimmy was still doing videos. He is, almost daily, which is both sad and amusing to me for some reason. And yeah, if they don't like it, they're free to voice their opinion on it. I personally can't voice my opinion on that subreddit because as you stated, I've been banned for since I think around episode 250. But I'm gonna keep on doing it even if I'm banned from that subreddit because I have freedom of speech. In the past I've stated, that atheism is kind of the religion of Reddit, and also that porn is kind of the religion of Reddit, but I think arguably the official religion of Reddit at this point is censorship. Redditors are addicted to censoring anyone who dissents at all, and I'm not going to let them censor me. They already censored me on this one subreddit, and they've censored me on many other subreddits as well, but they can't censor me on YouTube. YouTube isn't even that good a free speech platform. That's why stuff like Rumble exists. But it just goes to show you how bad Reddit is when it comes to free speech. Reddit used to be a free speech absolutist platform, and then the Orange Man happened, and now censorship is practically Reddit's favorite thing in the world. And that just goes to show you how, Reddit doesn't really have principles. It just has, they just want to force all their stuff onto you. It's like Orange Man bad. You're not allowed to dissent. If you dissent, you're going to either be mass downvoted or censored. And that just goes to show you that we gotta stand up for free speech, because if the free speech bastion that was Reddit in 2012 can fall as quickly as it did, it just goes to show you that free speech is something that's never ever guaranteed. Then we have Donald Trump says America should forget about separation of church and state. Trump said that instead of separation of church and state, he will bring religion back to our country, from LGBTQNation.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, Trump kind of does a lot of stuff to outrage people like that, and the progressive Redditors just keep falling for it. It's like when he tweets out an AI image of himself. Well, he trues it out. He didn't tweet it out. He might have tweeted it out as well, but I definitely saw it more on True Social than Twitter. But yeah, when he trues out an AI generated picture of him as the Pope, Redditors are all going to be all over, oh, this is super disrespectful, and they won't shut up about it. And that just goes to show you how, Trump just loves to troll and get on people's goat, and the progressive Redditors just keep taking the bait every time. If you want to defeat Donald Trump, the biggest thing you could do would be to ignore him and not take the bait every time. But sadly, Redditors don't seem too smart enough to do that. They just fall for whatever bait Trump lays out, and they eat it hook, line, sinker, and then repeat, etc., for pretty much a decade now. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump's speech at U of Alabama. Judges are interfering, supposedly based on due process. He said, but how can you give due process to people who come into our country illegally? From APnews.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross-post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, I think everyone in the country should be entitled to due process. But as I said in the past, it only depends on what the government feels like, because they're the ones with the legal monopoly on the use of force. So if they feel like giving only select people due process, or even no people due process, ultimately there's nothing you can do about it, because they control the police, they control the military, they control the legal system, and yeah, it just goes to show you that people think that the law is going to be inherently unbiased and impartial, but in reality, the law can just be whatever it feels like, since it's a monopoly, and there's no one to stop it unless you start your own government, and you're not allowed to do that. People in the past, they tried to secede from the country, and look how that turned out. The North sent the military down to the South to put down the rebellion, And yeah, it's just to show you, even if you want to, even if you want to start your own government, people will treat it as illegitimate, or they'll send in force to crush you. And yeah, that's why ultimately the state can justify whatever it feels like, and there's nothing you can do about it. Then we have Glendale police officer who killed unarmed man in park won't be prosecuted from abzcentral.com, posted by FimZL5563. And yeah, this is just another part of that. If the police want to just kill you in broad daylight, and sometimes, they have stuff like qualified immunity, which means you can't sue them in civil courts, and sometimes they won't even be prosecuted at all. So it just goes to show you how, if you do get on the bad side of the state, sometimes there's no recourse you can take against them, and yeah, that's why it just sucks to be you, I guess. And yeah, that's why I personally think we need individual government rather than forced collective government. But right now, the forced collective idea of everyone has to be under the same flag, and if the state wants to go after you at all for any reason whatsoever, it can. I don't think that's working. I think we need a system that's more based on voluntary interactions among individuals rather than forced interactions under anyone in a specific for everyone under in a specific territory. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have a budget crisis will cause a U.S. Civil War / Revolution 2.0 in the near future from Kung Fu Panda 45789. And that's a cross post that they made to the True Unpopular Opinion subreddit that they also made. And they said, we have a $2 trillion budget deficit. The federal government last year took in $4 trillion in taxes and spent $6 trillion. We have $36 trillion national debt, entitlement spending, Social Security, Medicare, etc. as a percentage of GDP is set to grow over time if we pass no new laws because of a decades-long and continuing collapse in birth rates and the shrinking worker-to-retiree ratio. That means fewer workers supporting more elderly people. In other words, boomers are retiring, and we've promised them a bunch of money we don't have. Other countries are in almost identical boat. The U.S. government is desperately trying to maintain low interest rates on the Treasury bonds it issues, but it won't be able to forever. The democratic process has no way of dealing with this problem, and every government in democratic countries knows this. It gets even better when you realize retirees are set to get an even larger fraction of the vote as the population ages. You can raise taxes on the rich, but ain't no way it's going to raise $2 trillion, much less fund the increases in social spending many want, while also allowing us to maintain a balanced budget. We have to cut entitlement spending at some point, but we won't. Young people eventually revolt and go around the normal political process to extract concessions. And I agree with most of that, but I don't know. I personally don't think the Civil War revolution is coming anytime soon. People seem to be too busy jerking themselves off on social media to do anything else when it comes to revolting or a civil war or anything like that. It makes you grateful that social media didn't come around until the last couple of years, comparatively speaking. Because if social media was around during like the Civil War or the American Revolution, there probably wouldn't have been any Civil War or Revolution. People would have just been jerking themselves off on social media rather than actually doing anything to fight for liberty in real life. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Maybe someday people will get off social media and start fighting, but I doubt it because it's interesting when you go on social media. It's always like the world's ending. Well, in real life, things seem to be relatively fine, and that just goes to show you how social media it has some impact on real life. I would say like when people go out to protest they saw on social media, but I still think it's relatively negligible, all things considered, because people, it's very much its own world, almost like its own world distinct from the real world. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have President Donald Trump's response when asked about due process for citizens and non-citizens after being questioned on the Fifth Amendment and his duty to uphold the Constitution. I don't know. And that's from Donald Key, and that's crosspost from the Law subreddit. And yeah, of course, that was an interview we had with on NBC News with, I think, Kristen Welker. And yeah, I personally don't really care for, Donald Trump, but, the media, the legacy media keeps putting him in these interviews where he, he doesn't really know what he's saying, so he just says, well, I don't know. And they use that as kind of like a trap question for him, saying, see, Trump doesn't think he has any duty to uphold the Constitution. Well, in reality, the Constitution has, never really been in that much of a force as people think it is from the second the ink was dry. It's like back when Andrew Jackson was president. John Marshall said, Andrew Jackson, you can't do the Trail of Tears. The Supreme Court says so. And then Andrew Jackson says, well, Marshall made a decision, now let him enforce it. And that just goes to show you how, none of the presidents really cared all that much for the Constitution. Donald Trump may be slightly more open about that, but, I definitely think the legacy media marketing him as a unique evil isn't the right perspective. They're all the presidents are inherently self-interested autocrats, I would say, and also figureheads, because they're not really the ones running the country. The alphabet agencies like CIA, NSA, FBI are really the ones who do it, and a military-industrial complex as well, I would say. And yeah, it's interesting how they always push that orange man bad narrative, but tons of bad stuff happened before Orange Man entered politics as well, and they didn't care about it back then. So it's just the corporate press really has no a ground to stand on here. Other than Orange Man bad because he's not a good enough puppet, I guess. And that's my thought on that issue. Then we have Trump orders the Bureau of Prisons to reopen Alcatraz from Yahoo.com, posted by Plasman30, and they added, Alcatraz was closed for two major reasons. It was destroyed by salt spray from the bay. Efforts to fix it in the 1950s were considered a lost cause. Two, the prison was 3 times more expensive to operate than any other federal prison in the U.S. This is a massive waste of taxpayer dollars. And I would agree with that. I personally think this is just Trump saying, giving some gusto, because, Alcatraz is really, one of the prisons that, really kind of hard to escape from since it's in the middle of the bay surrounded by sharks. But yeah, I personally think, it's probably not going to happen, but it's just Trump just as usual, he's saying it to get on people's goat, and without question, they'll take the bait every time. And yeah, I personally wouldn't take the bait, but they've been taking it for the people who've been taking it have been taking it for the past 10 years, pretty much without question. And yeah, I think they'll probably just do it more in the future until either Orange Man is politically irrelevant or dead. And yeah, that's my thoughts there. Then we have Trump administration says it will pay immigrants in the U.S. legally $1,000 to leave the country from Ground News, posted by Ragnar OKXG. And they had, if you read the article, it states that it would be an estimated $4,500 per person compared to $17,000. Either way, still a waste of money. And I would agree with that. Personally, I don't care for a lot illegal immigration. But if people do want to come here illegally, that they can justify whatever they want to. And if the government wants to say, "Oh, we'll give you money to leave," they should be able to do that as well. But I personally don't think it's very fiscally responsible, especially because what I think can happen is they'll say they'll leave and then they'll take the money, but then they'll just stay. So it just goes to show you that if people are just going to justify whatever they feel like, and illegal immigration's a good field to look at that in, because people if they want to justify moving in without filing all the correct forms, they'll just justify it. And yeah, I personally don't really think if people want to do that, they should be able to. I think the libertarian perspective is move around wherever you want to. But in the time of the welfare state, I do think maybe we should try and crack down on the welfare queens who are here illegally. Which I don't know how many of them there are. There are some illegal immigrants who are working in the fields, but I don't know how many of them are on the welfare state, how many of them in the fields. It's just there's so many people here. That's why I personally don't really care for any immigrants if they're on top of me. But if you wanna go wherever you feel like, go wherever you feel like. But I do think it's leading to the collapse of cultural homogeneity in a lot of the United States and other countries, and I don't think that's very good for when it comes to all the current culture war and stuff like that. People are divided and tribalistic, and yeah, everyone really feels like they're at each other's throats these days, depending on who's in the in-group and who's in the out-group. Then we have there was an attempt to fight against a made-up problem posted by FlimsyHow5563, and that's cross-post from There Was an Attempt subreddit, and that looks like a Instagram post from Texas Republicans are pushing the Furries Act. And yeah, I personally don't think we should have furries in school, but I don't know how big a problem that actually is. You know, a lot of politics, I would say, is more performative than substantial these days, especially in the age of social media, where, you know, everyone's constantly distracted by issues like LGBTQ or racism, that they don't care about stuff like budgets or any of the nitty-gritty work of government. Rather, they just care about whatever attention-grabbing headlines there are on social media. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump orders 100% tariff on foreign movies from CNN.com, posted by SluggyOX. And yeah, I personally don't like that decision. I personally think, Hollywood has been one of Trump's biggest opponents from day one, but now he's ordering a tariff on foreign movies. I personally think, foreign movies are probably less woke than a lot of Hollywood movies are already, so I personally don't want to have any. I personally think it's tariffs from the get-go, because, there are taxes, and taxes are inherently forced collectivism rather than voluntary collectivism. But, even with that, it just goes to show you that, Trump may market himself as being up against Hollywood, the Hollywood elites, but he'll do what they want when it comes to stifling their competition, so people will have to watch only domestic movies rather than have the option to watch foreign movies as well. And that's my thoughts on that issue. The next we have Bye Bye to Your Rights from Patom13, and that's a tweet from Ryan Rosbiani, who tweeted, Congress to ban boycotting Israel. The House will vote Monday on H.R. 867, the IGO Anti-Boycott Act. It proposes fines up to $1 million up to 20-year prison sentences for Americans participating in boycotts of Israel or its settlements. And yeah, I personally think that's very wrong. It's interesting how when a lot of I posted a meme earlier today from the Family Guy, the race card, where it's like, oh, if a black person does it, it's bad, but if a white person does it, it's okay. And then so instead of that, it's if the left does it, it's anti-Zionism, but if the right does it, it's anti-Semitism. Well, in reality, I would say there's a bunch of principled people on both sides of the aisle who are against the Israel pretty much being the puppet master of the U.S. government, and the American Israel PAC essentially being the most powerful lobby in a city chock full of them. But, it just goes to show you that, people will get distracted by stuff like whatever the current narrative is regarding identity politics and all that. Well, they'll let Israel completely off the hook for pretty much puppeteering around the U.S. government for decades upon decades at this point. And yeah, some people might say, "Oh, that's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory." If you're on the wrong side of the aisle, but it just goes to show you that what the Israeli government wants, the Israeli government generally gets. And increasingly, the foreign policy of the U.S. is not set in the House or the Senate or the President or the White House or the Supreme Court, but rather in the Likud. And yeah, I personally don't, or the Knesset. Likud's a large party in Israel. The Knesset's their government body. But yeah, increasingly they're the ones who tell the United States what to do, and people are waking up. But if when you wake up, you get speared as anti-Semitic. And even a MAGA guy like Donald Trump really ends up being more of a MAGA guy, make Israel great again. And yeah, I do think people are catching on. Younger Americans tend to be more anti-Israel than older Americans. So hopefully, as the years go on, the U.S. will wrestle free of the Israeli influence of its government. But I don't know how realistic that is anytime soon, especially when they can say, "Oh, you're anti-Semitic," if you dare dissent at all against them. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.